wasn't expecting that one. Yeah, it's just so great. This is why it's so nice to not have makeup on.
5 minutes ago, a quiet storage facility in California unlocked a unit linked to Meghan Markle. What they uncovered inside wasn't memorabilia or old furniture. No, this was evidence of a carefully orchestrated plan years in the making. A cache that could shift narratives and send shockwaves across oceans. Tonight, the monarchy braces itself for fallout. The opening of that unit has set off a California shockwave, one that neither coast was ready to absorb. Just after 6:30 a.m. on November 29th, as the soft winter dawn tinted the sky in muted pastels, a single phone call triggered a chain of events that moved faster than anyone could anticipate. The call came from a quiet, almost invisible storage facility tucked along a narrow road in Montecito, the kind of place built to go unnoticed, unremarkable, occupied usually by retirees downsizing or families shuffling between homes. But that morning, anonymity vanished. What defined the building wasn't its ordinary purpose, it was revelation. The facility manager, a man with over 20 years of experience who claimed he had never once encountered anything remotely scandalous, phoned the legal representative overseeing a court-ordered inventory check. His voice, normally calm and clipped, carried tension and an alertness that hinted at the extraordinary. This wasn't a routine visit. It was the beginning of a storm. "We opened the unit and you need to come now." Within 40 minutes, 2 unmarked vehicles arrived, their tires crunching on gravel still damp with coastal fog. A third car arrived quietly, its tinted windows concealing a single passenger. This individual was never publicly identified, but later confirmed to be linked to a high-level private security firm frequently engaged by celebrity clients. The scene was quiet, controlled, but charged with weighty anticipation. The storage unit itself had been rented nearly 4 years earlier, shortly after Meghan and Harry moved to California. It remained inactive for months at a time, only accessed irregularly, often in the dead of night or the early hours of morning. Nothing about it had drawn public suspicion. Yet, for palace insiders, the unit's existence had been an open secret, a quietly growing worry. California storage facilities hold millions of forgotten objects, but inside palace circles, that unit carried significance. From the earliest days of the Sussex departure, there were whispers, persistent, subtle, but never fully dismissed. Rumours circulated that Meghan had kept more than personal items from her royal life, materials that carried weight, the kind that could, under the right or wrong circumstances, rewrite narratives, reignite scandals, or expose long-buried tensions. Now, as the metal door rolled upward and cold fluorescent lights poured across the concrete floor, the truth shifted from rumour to reality. It lived in boxes, stacks of them, heavy ones, labelled ones, unlabelled ones. At least 5 were marked in thick black pen, with dates spanning 2018, 2019 and early 2020, the very period when everything changed for the Sussexes and the monarchy itself. By 7 a.m, word began to circulate, not yet to the public, but through private channels with far more influence than any broadcast network. Calls moved silently from Los Angeles to New York, from Washington to London. Inside the Royal Communications Office at Buckingham Palace, a senior advisor paused while reviewing morning reports. The alert flagged, California unit opened, preliminary content significant. That word, significant, was almost sacred in palace language. It rarely appeared unless the stakes were profound. Within 30 minutes, the message reached Kensington Palace. William's private secretary read it twice before forwarding it to the Prince of Wales, who was preparing for a scheduled briefing. Upon seeing the subject line, William froze mid-page. His expression tightened, a familiar seriousness that appeared only during moments of unexpected turbulence. He didn't ask what had been found. He asked only one question: how long before someone else finds out? Elsewhere in Buckingham Palace, the reaction was quieter but heavier. King Charles had just finished a round of early morning briefings when a senior advisor approached. Weeks of internal strain had taken their toll. Charles closed his eyes briefly, letting a weary exhale escape before responding. "What did they find?" he asked. His advisor hesitated. "We do not know yet, sir, but there were documents and recordings." Recordings. The word reverberated through the room like a warning bell. At almost the same moment, nearly 5,000 miles away in the Montecito foothills, Meghan was informed. She received the message while standing at a kitchen window, looking out over the hazy morning landscape. Her response was immediate: stillness, a measured breath, and a quiet whisper. Despite the polished control she and Harry projected to the world, they had anticipated this moment since the day they left Britain. They had prepared, yet nothing could prepare anyone for the speed at which this storm would travel. By mid-morning, the boxes were being photographed, logged, and sealed for careful examination. The individuals overseeing the process moved with deliberate urgency, fully aware that every item handled could not only reshape the Sussex narrative, but also destabilize the monarchy itself. At exactly 9:22 a.m. Pacific, the first box was opened. What it contained changed everything. No one spoke. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to dim, as if the very unit acknowledged the gravity of what lay inside. A stack of leather-bound journals, each carefully wrapped in archival paper. Most bore Meghan's unmistakable looping handwriting. On the top, the words, "Winter Notes, 2019" stared back. That year mattered. The year internal conversations turned sharp. Fractures began to show, and the monarchy shifted beneath everyone's feet. The inventory team exchanged professional, cautious looks, but beneath the surface, they knew the potential weight of these journals. Personal reflections, sensitive accounts, descriptions of meetings reduced publicly to two-line palace statements. Someone, at some point, had believed these pages were worth preserving far from British soil. The second layer revealed something even more startling: flash drives, not one or two, an entire row, each labelled only by month and year. No summaries, no descriptions, nothing beyond the barest timestamp. January 2020, February 2020, March 2020. The months leading up to the infamous announcement. The months when Harry and Meghan were negotiating their exit. The months when whispers ran through palace corridors, William and Harry barely speaking, Charles privately urging unity, the institution bracing for impact. Beside the drives were several sealed envelopes, each embossed with the royal crest. The detail chilled the room instantly. Such envelopes were never given lightly. They were never meant to sit in a California storage unit. One envelope even bore a handwritten note: private correspondence, keep secure. That phrase alone triggered alarm. This was no longer a routine inventory check. It was a high-level breach. The team lead made the call within seconds. Minutes later, the information reached London again, this time sharper, more urgent. The first report had said significant. The second said urgent. By early afternoon in the United Kingdom, the palace's crisis communications group had assembled in their underground briefing room, a space reserved for moments when stakes were too high for standard procedure. Phones were removed, devices swept, doors locked. The head of communications read aloud the preliminary summary transmitted from California: leather-bound journals, flash drives, royal crest envelopes. The room fell completely silent. A senior advisor finally broke the tension with the question everyone had been dreading. What if these contained private conversations, internal disputes, arguments never meant for public eyes? Another advisor answered quietly: then we face a narrative we cannot control. That was the nightmare scenario. Since Meghan had left Britain, the palace had relied on silence, strategic, calculated, dignified silence. That silence was now under threat. The monarchy had always navigated storms with careful precision, but journals and recordings had the power to unmake silence in an instant. No one felt the tremor more deeply than Princess Anne when she was briefed later that afternoon. She listened without interruption, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But those who knew her well noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw, a tell that irritation, rising and careful, was present. Not at Meghan herself, but at the chaos this revelation could unleash. Anne had weathered decades of royal upheaval, watched scandals flare and flare again. She had seen how quickly a private story could ignite into public spectacle. Yet these private documents, stored abroad, hinted at something different. They suggested intention, strategy, a long game, meticulously planned. Her first question was sharp. Does Harry know? The advisor hesitated. We believe he will, shortly. Anne exhaled slowly, bracing herself. Across London, William received the briefing in measured tones. He did not raise his voice, nor show shock, but his private secretary noted the way his gaze shifted. Not angry, but calculating. William understood the stakes, understood the truth more clearly than most. If the journals from those final months contained even a fraction of the tension long rumoured behind closed doors, the monarchy was about to enter a new, icy winter, and the storm wouldn't wait. The journals, the drives, the secrets, none of it had been expected. By mid-morning in California, the second box was opened. If the first box had been concerning, this one was explosive. Inside lay folders, each organised with meticulous care. Meghan's team was known for precision, but this went far beyond ordinary archiving. These were curated, deliberate records, immediately recognisable to anyone familiar with the internal machinery of the royal household. These were not merely Meghan's personal belongings. They were palace documents, copies of schedules, meeting summaries, internal briefing notes, some stamped private, others confidential, many bearing initials of senior household officials. The inventory team paused, unsure if they should proceed without additional authorization, but instructions from the supervising attorney were clear. Catalogue everything, photograph everything, do not interpret, do not speculate. Still, speculation seeped like fog. One folder stood out before anything was even opened. A thick packet labelled Commonwealth Discussions, Winter 2019, with personal annotations inside. That single phrase sent an instant ripple of alarm through secure channels back to London. Winter 2019 had been one of the tensest periods of the Sussex era. It had been filled with private negotiations, shifting expectations, and disagreements over Meghan's emerging role within the Commonwealth project. An initiative meant to integrate her heritage, global appeal, and the monarchy's long-term vision. Publicly, the initiative appeared unified. Privately, it was friction. And now, tucked away in a California storage unit, these records could reveal who supported her, who resisted, and who had tried to reshape the narrative entirely. The supervising attorney handled the folder gently, as if touching it might ignite it, then placed it in a secure case separate from the others. But what truly changed the atmosphere in the room was the discovery beneath the folders. A slim black recording device. Not new, not cutting edge. A model easy to conceal, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. It had been stored without batteries, wrapped carefully in cloth, and placed beside a set of USB drives yet to be processed. The label read only 2019 notations, not recordings. The team lead froze. Everyone in the room instantly grasped what this might mean. Were these recordings of conversations, voice memos, personal reflections, or, the scenario no one dared articulate, private palace meetings captured for personal protection? Whatever the truth, the discovery was significant. The team immediately halted further inspection, sending a red-level alert straight through the legal network to London. William, Charles, and Princess Anne were all flagged within minutes. Charles received the update quietly, as though bracing for something he had long expected. Bad news, but not for recordings. The king sank into his chair, a slow, heavy ache settling behind his eyes. The monarchy had survived decades of gossip and scandal. What it feared most were receipts, proof that validated what the public speculated but had never confirmed. His first instinct was dread, not anger. What if these notes contained Catherine's name? What if they held private conversations he assumed were secure? What if this device had captured conflicts the public had only guessed at? As these possibilities pressed on him, another fear emerged, one he rarely voiced, even in private. Has Meghan always felt unsafe inside the institution? William's reaction was different, controlled, cautious, strategic. He understood that any recordings could immediately reshape narratives he had spent years stabilizing. He also knew the press would erupt the moment anything leaked. Princess Anne's reaction, however, was the sharpest. Upon hearing the words recording device, she closed her eyes briefly, bracing herself. She had lived longer in the monarchy than any of them and knew that institutions were not undone by scandal. They were undone by evidence of scandal. Her response was immediate. Secure everything before anyone else does. But the most sobering moment came when the California team opened the third box. They found something no one had expected. Something that had no tie to schedules, meetings, or royal protocols. Several handwritten letters addressed to Meghan from people inside the palace. And then, at the very bottom, a single envelope. Its handwriting unmistakable, curved and elegant. Diana. Of course, Diana had passed over 2 decades earlier. This was not a letter from her, but it was something connected to her legacy, sealed, preserved, waiting. Something that, once opened, could transform every story that came after. The letters, the legacy, and the fear spreading through the palace combined into a moment of suspended tension. For a long moment, no one in the California storage unit moved. The third box remained open, its contents fanned across the table like the remnants of a secret long kept, history spilling into daylight. But the envelope, bearing Diana's unmistakable handwriting, instantly transformed a troubling discovery into a crisis. Everyone understood that what had been preserved here was more than papers or recordings. It was a thread stretching back decades, linking private history to the present, fragile, powerful, and potentially explosive. The inventory team froze. Each person understood they were staring at something that should, by any measure of logic or protocol, not be here. Diana's handwriting, in a storage unit belonging to Meghan Markle, in Montecito. In late November, the supervising attorney approached the envelope carefully, lifting it with the kind of deliberate stillness usually reserved for objects far older, far rarer, far more volatile than this. There was no date on the outside, no subject line, just a name, Meghan. That single word sent a shockwave across the Atlantic faster than any official memorandum could have, because the palace knew Diana's correspondence had been archived, meticulously tracked, catalogued, and preserved. For a letter to appear outside that system, unaccounted for, could only mean one thing. Someone had deliberately saved it. Someone had passed it along privately. Someone had ensured it reached Meghan by early afternoon Pacific time. A fourth urgent alert raced to Buckingham Palace. Charles, already shaken by earlier updates about recordings, read the new briefing while standing in his private study. The weak winter light cast long shadows across the aged furniture. When he reached the line referencing a sealed envelope in Diana's hand, he stopped breathing. For a half-second, he whispered one word, impossible. Because Charles knew Diana had been many things, charismatic, defiant, emotional, brilliant, but careless was never one of them. If she wrote to someone, it was intentional. If she preserved something, it had purpose. If she passed something meant for the future, it carried meaning. Charles sank into his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose while the advisor stood silently nearby. The king looked not frightened, but heartbroken. Not Meghan, he murmured. Why Meghan? He did not speak in accusation, but in a question heavy with decades of unresolved grief. If Diana had truly written something intended for Meghan, everything became complicated. His son's relationship, the monarchy's tension, the public perception of Meghan as either threat or victim, depending on which side of the Atlantic one stood. William received the update minutes later. His reaction was quieter, steadier, but unmistakably grim. Diana's legacy was the one thing William guarded fiercely, protectively at times, possessively at others, but always with profound loyalty. The idea that a private letter from her had circulated outside palace knowledge, outside archival preservation, outside the family entirely, pierced deeper than duty alone. When his private secretary finished reading, William asked only one question: has Harry seen it? The answer, no, but the question itself revealed the epicenter of the storm now forming. If the letter reached Meghan after Diana's death, Harry must have been involved or known someone who was. If it had reached Meghan before Harry even met her, the implications were staggering. Across Windsor, Princess Anne was briefed in her study, the old stone fireplace glowing faintly with winter embers. Anne read the summary slowly, then set the paper aside. Her expression tightened into a rare, unmistakable unease. When she spoke, her voice was low, edged with steel. Whatever is in that letter cannot remain in California. Anne's concern wasn't scandal. It was preservation. Royal archives were more than boxes and shelves. They were the backbone of historical truth, the defense against revisionism, the only safeguard an institution had against time's distortions. But in California, the unfolding reaction was entirely different. When Meghan learned of the letter, her response was sorrowful, not shocking. She asked quietly, "Did they open it?" "No, not yet," came the reply. Meghan closed her eyes and released a slow, controlled breath. Not relief, but inevitability. She already knew, on some level, what was inside. Meanwhile, the California team continued cataloguing. Beneath the envelope addressed in Diana's hand lay letters from senior palace figures, some warm, some cautious, some unreadable in tone. Notes detailed early press strategies, private reassurances from certain advisors, and one particularly jarring item, a printed transcript from a phone conversation between two palace officials discussing Meghan's public reception during her first months in the family. The final line read, "She will need to be managed carefully." The room grew colder as they read it. This was no longer a story about a difficult duchess or a strained family dynamic. It was the beginning of a pattern the world had suspected, but which the palace had always denied. Now it existed in black and white. One attorney whispered under his breath, "This is bigger than we thought." He was wrong. It was far bigger. Panic rose as the palace divide and Meghan's California decision collided. The fifth box proved heavier than the others. Not physically, but emotionally. Everyone in the storage unit felt it, their hands pressing the cardboard. The weight, the density, the deliberate organization suggested this was not merely another set of files or journals. This was a box of intention. At 10:48 a.m., they lifted the lid. Inside, stacked like museum artifacts, were binders meticulously labelled with date ranges, each covering specific windows of Meghan's time inside the royal household. The earliest binder, Summer 2017, introduction period. Next, Autumn 2017, pre-engagement notes. Then, 2018, public transition. 2019, internal correspondence. 2020, exit negotiations. Like chapters in a story, the public believed they already understood, but none of this aligned with the palace's version. These were Meghan's, her notes, her records, her preservation of truth as she experienced it. The supervising attorney inhaled slowly, steadying himself before opening the first binder. Inside were laminated copies of press briefings, internal emails, and pages of Meghan's handwritten annotations, filling every margin with careful, controlled script. Certain phrases were underlined aggressively, others circled, some marked with stars. A few carried short, devastating comments. Not accurate. This was said privately, not publicly. Why is the narrative shifting? But the binder that made everyone pause, even the cameras felt intrusive, was labelled 2019 Communications Review. Inside were printed screenshots of private WhatsApp groups among staff, Slack messages, internal summaries of media tone, and correspondence about handling the growing public tension surrounding Meghan's coverage. Halfway through, the team discovered a thread between two senior palace aides dated late autumn 2019. "She is drawing too much focus. Again, we need to redirect the narrative. We have options. Keep this quiet." The team lead whispered, "This is the kind of language that starts inquiries." But the most jarring discovery came next, a folder containing prepared drafts of statements. The palace had never released some, softened Meghan's image, clarified misinformation, or defended her outright. Publicly, the world saw only silence. The attorney closed the binder gently, visibly shaken. Meanwhile, in London, alarm had escalated to fear. Inside Clarence House, King Charles held a closed-door meeting with two senior advisors. His voice remained steady, but the tremor in his hands betrayed the internal earthquake he was navigating. He understood the binders, the letter, and the recordings. If authenticated, each would alter the monarchy's future. Charles had always believed the public could forgive almost anything, except hypocrisy. Yet the binders suggested omissions, calculated omissions, not lies, not fabrications, but gaps capable of fracturing trust across Windsor. Princess Anne was briefed again. She listened with stillness carved from stone. Anne had defended the monarchy through every era of turbulence, from Diana's tumultuous years to Andrew's collapse to the Sussex departure. But this was different. This was a Trojan horse, a box of truths, carefully prepared, quietly stored, accidentally discovered. Ever the realist, Anne grasped the implications immediately. She spoke with characteristic bluntness. "These are not souvenirs. These are safeguards." Charles flinched at the word. Safeguards. Because if Meghan viewed these materials as protection, it meant she had entered the monarchy already believing she would one day need a defence. It was a damning realisation. Meanwhile, William received a fuller briefing in Kensington Palace, and for the first time since this crisis began, he paced, a habit inherited from Diana during moments of unbearable pressure. His concern was not only about the press, not even about the monarchy's reputation. What troubled him most was Harry. If Meghan had preserved this material, Harry had to have known, or worse, maybe he didn't. Both possibilities were catastrophic. If Harry knew, he had helped shield documents that could destabilize the monarchy. If he didn't, Meghan had built a parallel narrative entirely separate from him. Either scenario threatened the fragile equilibrium. William had spent years trying to maintain it, but in California, the emotional landscape was entirely different. When the attorney delivered a second update to Meghan, she listened quietly, a calmness settling over her, almost unnatural given the magnitude of the revelations. She asked only one question. "Have they seen the last box?" "Last box?" The attorney frowned. "We've opened 5. There are 6. Meghan exhaled gently, as though confirming something she had long anticipated. Then she said, "The last one isn't mine." A beat of silence followed. The attorney asked, confused, "Whose is it?" Meghan paused. Her answer was soft, measured, devastating. Harry's. That sentence changed everything. If the 6th box belonged to Harry, if it contained his notes, his timeline, his correspondence, his personal reflections from the years when the brothers' relationship fractured, then this was no longer merely a Meghan story. This was a royal story, a succession story, a story about the future of the monarchy itself. The attorney asked whether opening the 6th box would complicate matters. Meghan replied, "It won't complicate things, it will explain them." Thousands of miles away in Buckingham Palace, Charles felt the shift in the air before anyone even spoke aloud. This was no longer about Meghan's storage unit. This was about the truth everyone had feared was coming. Harry's box was smaller than the others, almost unassuming, tucked against the back wall of the storage unit, as though deliberately placed there. Last, perhaps reluctantly. But the label on the front was unmistakable. Harry's handwriting, untidy, rushed, uneven in pressure, the script of a man who had always carried too much emotion in his grip. It read, "Private. Do not open without me." The supervising attorney hesitated. This was the first box that presented a human dilemma rather than a purely legal one. At 11:59 a.m., they opened it. Inside were folders, but unlike Meghan's meticulously organised binders, Harry's materials were scattered, inconsistent. Some pages were dog-eared, others smudged or hastily scribbled. This was not archival preservation, this was heartbreak in paper form. The first folder they lifted was labelled William, 2014 to 2020. The room went silent. Inside were printouts of messages exchanged between the brothers during a period when Harry's anxiety worsened, when public attention became suffocating, and when Meghan had not yet entered the picture. Messages filled with warmth, annoyance, brotherly teasing, but later, tension seeped through every word. One page, marked in Harry's handwriting, read, "This is when it changed." The inventory team exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer simply a question of palace transparency. This was the anatomy of a fracture. Beneath that folder lay another, Father. Inside were letters Harry had written to Charles. Some never sent. Some contained Charles's responses attached. These were not political documents or strategic communications. These were personal. A son reaching for a father he felt slipping away. A father balancing love with duty and the demands of the crown. One line, circled 3 times in Harry's hand, read, "I can't be the spare if the role costs me myself." The attorney closed the folder briefly, letting the weight of those words settle. Then he continued. The next set of documents were notes Harry had taken during meetings in which he felt sidelined. Meetings where decisions about Meghan's role were made without him. Notes where he recorded, in painstaking detail, the growing sense that the monarchy saw him not as a man building a family, but as a variable to be managed. A yellow sticky note attached to one page read, in red ink, "No one asked what this feels like," but it was the envelope at the bottom of the box that silenced the room entirely. A plain, unmarked envelope, sealed not with tape, but with red wax, the imprint perfectly preserved. Inside, a single letter. The supervising attorney swallowed. Diana. No one spoke as he lifted it. No one breathed as he examined the seal. No one dared suggest opening it without authorization, because this was not just a relic. This was a message, whether Diana had written it years ago and saved it for her sons, or whether it had been passed to Harry after her death. The meaning was unmistakable. It belonged to a mother, a future king, and a son who had spent his entire adult life trying to understand the wounds she left behind. At that same moment, across the ocean, the palace was unraveling in ways no one could contain. Inside Kensington Palace, William received confirmation. Harry's box contained personal correspondence. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw set. For the first time since the crisis began, grief, not anger, crossed his face. Because whatever those documents held, they would tell Harry's story in his own words, unfiltered, unedited, unprotected by the palace machinery. And William knew exactly what that meant. Harry had not just preserved memories, he had preserved evidence of the closeness they once had, the distance that grew between them, and the choices that had pushed them onto diverging paths. At Clarence House, Charles responded with something between heartbreak and resignation, a father's sorrow, not a king's. He understood now. The California discovery was not an attack, not a threat. It was a record of what the monarchy had asked of its sons, a record of failures on all sides, a record of years spent trying and failing to hold a family together while keeping a kingdom upright. Princess Anne was briefed last. She responded in the only way she knew how, with clarity. Her words were blunt, brutal, true. This is the moment we feared, not because of scandal, because of honesty. Back in California, Meghan stood alone in her kitchen, hands resting lightly against the counter. As she listened to the update, the attorney told her Harry's box had been opened despite the warning written on its lid. She nodded slowly, not with surprise, but acceptance. She whispered, the truth was always going to surface. The crisis was no longer about missing documents or unexpected discoveries. It was about legacy. It was about a fracture. It was about two brothers divided by time, pressure, and narratives, neither fully controlled. And now, the world would see pieces of that fracture, pieces never meant to be seen in quiet daylight. After the storm, the boxes in California stood like unsealed chapters of family history, long buried beneath duty and silence. What Meghan kept, what Harry preserved, and what the palace feared, now hung in the balance, reshaping a legacy the monarchy could no longer contain or control. If you want more explosive royal revelations like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. We're only scratching the surface of the story no one thought would ever come to light.